The first sale. The scam that shocked Paris without Paris ever knowing. Paris, 1925. The Eiffel Tower gleamed in the afternoon sun, its iron frame shimmering like a giant metronome over the city. People bustled beneath it, tourists snapping photos, vendors selling trinkets, children chasing each other across the Champ de Mars. To them, the tower was untouchable, a landmark, a constant. But somewhere across the Seine, in a private room of the Hôtel de Crillon, a group of businessmen believed otherwise. They believed the Eiffel Tower was about to vanish. The illusion of authority. Victor Lustig played his role flawlessly. Dressed in tailored suits, polished shoes, and with the demeanor of a man used to power, he was every inch the government official he pretended to be. He carried himself with a quiet urgency, the kind of seriousness that made the men lean in closer. He showed them the forged documents, letters with official seals, papers stamped with government insignia, plans that looked both technical and confidential. The story was simple, believable, and timed perfectly. The Eiffel Tower was expensive to maintain. Its iron was rusting, its upkeep draining resources. The public loved it, yes, but the government could no longer afford it. Quietly, behind closed doors, the decision had been made. The tower was to be dismantled and sold for scrap. But the public must not know. Not yet. Hence the secrecy. Hence their presence in this quiet, private meeting. The bidders. There were 5 men at the table, wealthy scrap metal dealers who had been told they were specially chosen for their reputation, their reliability, their discretion. And there it was again, the genius of Lustig. He knew people wanted not just money, but importance. Each of the men wanted to be the one who won. The one who could say he'd been trusted with France's great secret. The bidding began quietly, nervously, but soon grew heated. The Eiffel Tower was more than a pile of iron. It was prestige. It was glory. And as the bids rose, Lustig watched, calm as a chess master. The mark, André Poisson. From the beginning, Lustig had already chosen his victim, André Poisson. Poisson was not the richest man in the room, but he was the most eager. He was hungry for validation, desperate to be seen as a player among Paris's elite. He was also insecure, a man with money, but not the social polish of his rivals. Lustig exploited every weakness. He whispered to Poisson privately, assuring him he was the frontrunner. He hinted that the government valued his discretion more than anyone else's, and then he added the final deadly hook. But of course, as with all government dealings, there are complications. The bride. Poisson leaned in. Complications? Lustig sighed, lowering his voice. He explained that certain ministers expected personal assurances, payments off the record, to ensure the deal's smooth approval. This wasn't unusual in Poisson's mind. He had heard whispers of such things before, and more importantly, he didn't want to lose the deal. So he paid. Not just for the tower, but for the bribe, a fortune in today's money. The escape. The ink barely dry, Lustig packed his belongings, collected the money, and vanished. Within days he was across the border in Austria, enjoying his newfound wealth. Paris carried on as normal. The tower still stood, the city still glittered. No one suspected a thing, except André Poisson. The silence of the victim. Imagine Poisson's horror when he realized the truth. He hadn't bought the Eiffel Tower. He hadn't secured a government contract. He had been tricked. But here's the genius of Lustig's plan. Poisson couldn't tell anyone. How could he go to the police? How could he file a complaint saying, "I thought I was buying the Eiffel Tower"? He would be laughed out of every office in Paris. His reputation, his business, his dignity, all would be destroyed. And so, Poisson said nothing. He swallowed his humiliation, hid his shame, and carried on as though nothing had happened. Which meant, Lustig got away clean. The perfect crime. Most cons end in exposure. Someone speaks out, word spreads, the law closes in. But Lustig's Eiffel Tower scam was nearly perfect. No police reports, no headlines, no witnesses, just silence. It should have ended there. Lustig should have retired, or at least moved on to safer, smaller scams. But Victor Lustig was not satisfied. He hadn't just tasted wealth, he had tasted genius. He had proven he could make the impossible believable. And so he returned to Paris. He looked up once again at the Iron Giant, and he thought, why not sell it again? Before we go deeper, pause for a second. Stories like this, they're wild, unbelievable, but true. And this channel, Blood and Fortune, is where you'll always find them. So if you're loving this story so far, make sure you hit subscribe so you don't miss part 3. Drop a like if you're amazed by Lustig's audacity. Share this with a friend who thinks scams only happen today, because Victor Lustig's story is just getting started. The return. Most men would never risk repeating the same crime. The danger was too high. The first victim might speak out. Rumors might spread. But Lustig wasn't most men. He had calculated the odds. Poisson's silence had been his shield. If one victim stayed quiet, maybe others would too. And so, he returned. He dusted off his forged documents. He booked the private salons of the Hôtel de Crillon again. He invited a new round of scrap metal dealers. The script was the same. The tower was decaying. The government wanted it gone. But this time, Lustig played with fire. Because not every victim was willing to stay silent. The second attempt, greed, repetition, and a game of fire. The Eiffel Tower loomed again in the Parisian sky, as unshakable as ever. To the city, it was a landmark of pride. To Victor Lustig, it was unfinished business. He had done the impossible once, and gotten away clean. He had crossed the border with suitcases full of cash, no police trailing him, no headlines naming him. Most criminals would have stopped there. They would have bought estates, melted into luxury, or retired into quiet shadows. But Lustig wasn't most criminals. He wasn't driven by money alone. He was driven by the game. Why return? Some say Lustig returned because the first sale hadn't satisfied him. Others say he was reckless, greedy, addicted to the thrill of deception. Whatever the reason, one fact was undeniable. The silence of his first victim, André Poisson, had emboldened him. If Poisson had not gone to the police, then perhaps no one ever would. The plan had worked perfectly once. Why not again? So in the summer of 1925, not long after his first sale, Lustig slipped back into Paris. Same city, same hotel, same playbook. The setup repeated. The Hôtel de Crillon once again became the stage. Its ornate halls and gilded ceilings gave legitimacy to the con. Lustig gathered a new set of wealthy scrap metal dealers, lured in by secret invitations. The story was unchanged. The tower's upkeep was bankrupting the government. Its iron was rusting, the costs unbearable. Quietly, officials had decided to dismantle and sell it for scrap. They, the chosen few, had been selected to bid for the prize. The forged documents were as flawless as before. The seals, the stamps, the signatures, all convincing. Lustig's charm did the rest. Once again, the men leaned in. Once again, they saw not a monument but a fortune. But something was different. This time, however, there was a shift. Perhaps it was the whispers of disbelief in the room. Perhaps the growing suspicion among the bidders. One man in particular didn't fall so easily into Lustig's spell. Unlike Poisson, this man was not insecure. He was seasoned, cautious, and shrewd. He had built his wealth not just on ambition but on skepticism. He asked too many questions. He wanted details Lustig wasn't prepared to give. And for the first time, Victor Lustig felt the cracks in his masterpiece, the near exposure. At the edge of the bidding table, the skeptical dealer leaned back in his chair. "Something doesn't add up," he muttered. The other men froze. In that moment, the spell was nearly broken. One accusation, one raised voice, one call to the authorities, and Lustig's con would have shattered. Lustig's mind raced. His con wasn't just money now, it was survival. If the wrong man spoke, prison was guaranteed. The escaped victor made a decision. He abandoned the second sale midstream. He never waited for bids to close, never signed contracts. He excused himself with the grace of a diplomat, folded up his papers, and disappeared into the Parisian night. By the time suspicion had curdled into certainty, Lustig was gone. Out of Paris, out of France, out of reach. The Eiffel Tower still stood, untouched, mocking the very men who had nearly fallen for its sale. Again. The legacy of the second attempt. Lustig hadn't gotten the payday he hoped for the second time, but what he did gain was more valuable in another way. Legend. By attempting the scam twice, once successful, once aborted, he etched his name into the folklore of con artistry. It wasn't just that he had stolen money, it was that he had stolen the impossible. The man had looked at the symbol of Paris, the most recognizable structure in Europe, and decided it was for sale, and people believed him. Twice. The psychology of the scam. What made Lustig so dangerous wasn't just his forgeries or charm. It was his understanding of human nature. He knew the powerful wanted to feel chosen. He knew greed made men blind. He knew shame would keep victims silent. Every detail of his con was rooted in psychology. Lustig didn't just sell the Eiffel Tower, he sold desire. And that perhaps was the greatest trick of all. Seeds of downfall. But even legends fall. The same greed and daring that had made Lustig a genius would eventually make him careless. Though he had evaded capture in Paris, his name began circulating in Europe's underworld. Whispers of the man who sold the Eiffel Tower spread like wildfire. Soon, his crimes would catch up with him, not in Paris, but in America. And his capture would prove as dramatic as his scams. And that, my friends, brings us to part 4, the fall of Victor Lustig. From the Eiffel Tower to Al Capone's Chicago, from forged government seals to the most daring swindle in U.S. history, Lustig's life was destined for a spectacular end. The fall of Victor Lustig, from the Eiffel Tower to Alcatraz, the end of a master con. Victor Lustig's escape from Paris after his second Eiffel Tower attempt should have been the closing chapter of his career. He had proven himself a genius, a ghost who could slip through cracks no one else dared to enter. But instead of fading into obscurity, Lustig's hunger carried him across the Atlantic, to America, a land brimming with money, ambition, and men just as greedy as his marks in Paris. And in America, Lustig would meet both his greatest triumphs and his inevitable downfall. The Romanian box. In the 1920s, America was roaring. Jazz, prohibition, skyscrapers, and fortunes being made overnight. It was the perfect hunting ground for a con man of Lustig's caliber. Here, he unleashed one of his most infamous inventions, the Romanian money box. It was a small wooden device, polished and mysterious, with rollers and compartments. Lustig would tell victims it was a miraculous machine capable of printing real banknotes. All it required was a small investment of cash to prime the box. And then slowly, with a whir of gears, it would feed out authentic bills. At first, it seemed to work. The machine produced genuine notes. Lustig had hidden them inside. The victim, wide-eyed with belief, would pay thousands, even tens of thousands, for the device. By the time they realized it was a fraud, Lustig was long gone. The scam was so audacious, so theatrical, that it cemented his reputation in America as the smoothest crook alive. The Al Capone swindle. But Victor Lustig's boldest move in America was against a man few dared to cross. Al Capone. Capone, the king of Chicago's underworld, was feared across the nation. To con him was a death sentence, unless you were Victor Lustig. Lustig approached Capone with a plan, an investment scheme. He asked Capone for $50,000, promising to double it in 60 days. Capone agreed, intrigued but wary. 60 days later, Lustig returned, not with profits, but with the original $50,000 untouched. "I'm sorry," Lustig said smoothly. "The deal fell through, but I didn't want you to lose your money." Capone was stunned. Here was a man who seemed honest. No one had ever returned his money before. Impressed by Lustig's integrity, Capone handed him $5,000 as a gesture of respect. That $5,000 was the real con. Lustig had played Capone himself and walked away alive. The net tightens, but even the cleverest fox eventually leaves tracks. Lustig's frauds had grown too loud, too widespread. His name was whispered not only in saloons and backrooms, but in the corridors of the U.S. Secret Service. By the early 1930s, Lustig wasn't just a con artist. He had become a counterfeiter, producing high-quality fake U.S. currency that spread like wildfire through the economy. This time, it wasn't just rich victims at stake. It was the stability of the dollar itself. And when you threatened America's money, you invited its full wrath. The chase. Secret Service agents hounded him across the country. Lustig, true to form, slipped away countless times. He used dozens of aliases, charmed his way through hotels, and vanished just as nets closed in. He was, as one agent later admitted, the slickest con man who ever lived. But in 1935, betrayal finally caught him. His own mistress, bitter and angry at his infidelity, tipped off the authorities. Lustig was arrested in New York City. The great illusionist of greed had finally been cornered. The escape. Yet even in chains, Lustig's genius shone. Awaiting trial in custody, he did the unthinkable. He escaped from jail. Slipping out of the Manhattan Correctional Center, he vanished once more, humiliating his captors. Newspapers across the country blared headlines. Eiffel Tower swindler escapes. But the glory was short-lived. Weeks later, the Secret Service tracked him down in Pittsburgh. This time, there would be no escape. Alcatraz. Convicted of counterfeiting and fraud, Lustig was sentenced to 20 years in prison. His destination? Alcatraz. The Rock, America's most notorious fortress for the untouchable, the dangerous, and the unbreakable. Al Capone himself was there. Now Lustig, the man who conned Capone, joined him behind bars. It was the ultimate irony. The man who once sold the Eiffel Tower now stared at walls of iron bars, his cons reduced to fading memories. The end of the con. Victor Lustig spent his final years in prison, his health failing. In 1947, at the age of 57, he died quietly of pneumonia in a medical ward, far from the grand hotels, the champagne rooms, the glittering parlors where he once spun lies into gold. But his legend lived on. The legacy of Lustig. Victor Lustig wasn't just a thief. He was an artist. His crimes were performances, his victims willing participants in a theater of greed. He exposed not just the weakness of systems, but the weakness of men. Their hunger for profit, their fear of missing out, their silence in shame. And perhaps that's why his story endures. Because while the Eiffel Tower still stands, unshaken and eternal, the truth remains. For a brief moment in history, one man convinced the world it could be sold. Twice. And that is the story of Victor Lustig, the man who sold the Eiffel Tower. Twice. If you enjoyed this story, don't just watch. Join the journey. Subscribe to Blood and Fortune for more unbelievable tales of wealth, crime, and power. Like this video if you think Lustig's story deserves a movie. Share it with someone who believes scams are a modern invention. Because history doesn't just repeat itself. Sometimes, it cons itself.